When God's people finally left the wilderness stage of their experience and actually began to move into the land that God had planned as an inheritance, the land we actually call the Promised Land. And then they actually ate some of the produce, some of the fruit of that land. They began to enjoy the blessing. And when that happened, the manna ceased. Now what does that have to do with you and I? Well, it's recognizing that we have to grow to a greater maturity to receive God's blessings. That the land, the produce of the land, all that was in the land was God's intended inheritance, His intended blessing for them. And He had, as the story goes on, so much more, so much greater that He not only desired and planned for them, but was awaiting them. But see, their prior experience had been manna. And manna allowed for a certain degree of immaturity. You didn't have to have a profound relationship with God because literally, now you were dependent on God, but literally every day you would go outside your tent and that blessing was just waiting for you. Receiving it in that context meant just opening your door and picking it up. But when they began to go into the promised land, that manna ceased. That type of blessing, the way they received it, ceased. And now then it was going to require a deeper, more profound relationship with Him, a greater maturity and a greater faith. But the reward was unbelievable. It was amazing. And the lesson for you and I is the same. See, before, where they could just go out and receive what God had just placed there for them. It is kind of the attitude so often we get that, well, He's the all-loving, all-powerful God, and the blessing would just fall upon us. But the reality is, the maturity process means that the greater is something that we battle for. Now what does that mean? And that shouldn't be intimidating. But what we see as God's people began to take possession of the land, every obstacle they faced was greater than their ability. But on the other side of that obstacle was greater blessing. And it required not just a deeper dependence on God than they had with manna, because it's easy to get comfortable, but it also required them to have this relationship with God where they sought Him for direction. They sought Him for strategy and blessing. And in doing so, they defeated so many nations greater than them. The obstacles were never too big for the blessing that was awaiting them. And the times when they thought they had it handled, when it looked easy enough, when they just, as we all do, when they strategized on their own, the results were generally, to greater or lesser degrees, pretty disastrous. They were never the fullness of God's blessing. And it's that reminder for us. See, when God says in the Old Testament, when it talks about inheriting the land, we have this mental picture of it just something you just get. But the reality is that word inherit means to possess or to seize. But it also, that battle, that seizing also recognizes we don't have the ability. So how were they to seize it? They were to seize it by trusting God and following His lead, following His direction. And it didn't really change that much in the New Testament. Because in the New Testament, when we talk about receiving from God, again, it creates that idea that just falling upon us, when the reality is that word receive in the New Testament is very similar. And in fact, one definition is to authoritatively appropriate what has already been provided. So it's a bold faith that is required to receive. But along with that bold faith, we also have to seek God for the direction. What's our response? What's our action? Is it just trusting, or is there some response, some action we need to take? That in doing so, we continue to develop that closer and closer relationship with God. And we will, because nobody did it perfect but Jesus, we will from time to time fall back on that old habit that it looks easy, that often it doesn't even cross our mind to seek the Holy Spirit for direction. In the same way, the only way that we will receive all that God has for us is we have to stop being little children who are looking for that manna that's just waiting for us, and recognize God has the blessings. He's tied them up inside His promises, that just as the land was the inheritance for those people, for you and I, God's promises are our inheritance. His promises are the blessings. They're everything that we need are tied up in His promises. And as we, by the leading of the Holy Spirit and applying faith, as we begin to learn how to release the power in those promises, then we see them moving from the spiritual and impacting the natural. So just as they matured, they moved beyond manna. They began to receive what God had, not by just waiting for it to fall upon them, but by His leading, by His direction, and overcoming, battling through obstacles that seemed insurmountable. And in doing so, God was glorified and they received the blessing that awaited.